Do you, and on that same subject, we've seen the Russians and even the Chinese sort of snap out that type of dogma. And we were watching some of the recruitment videos that they put out for their military in particular, compared to some of our recruitment videos and even for our intelligence agencies, where our people are talking about being cisgender millennials with some emotional issues coming from two-mom households. This is what we're putting out and recruiting as our frontline defense of our nation.
Yeah, it's beyond bizarre.
It really is.
It has no chance of success. But the Russians and the Chinese, again, you're talking about nations with thousands of years of history, culture, experience, deeply rooted also in philosophies of life. In the case of Russia, Orthodox Christianity. In the case of China, Confucianism. These things are permanent fixtures, and what the leaders of these respective states have concluded is that if you want to hold the state together, you've got to reinforce and strengthen the ties that bind people to each other. It makes perfect sense.
It does.
There's also the other thing is, if you're a Russian, and this is something Americans don't understand, our military heritage is very different from what most people experience. I mean, even if we were to talk about the Serbs reaching back hundreds of years, we don't have a long history of fighting major wars against invading enemies. We simply don't. We were always very fortunate because we had the Atlantic and the Pacific on either side. And as we expanded to the west and we consolidated our borders, we tended to defend ourselves in the south and push back against criminality and invasion from the south when it occurred. It was never very strong, and we were able to overpower it. And we had friendly neighbors to the north who, for the most part, cooperated with us. So we have a very different history. Our history is much closer to what you would expect to find in Great Britain.
Sure.
We're essentially a large island. Island people think and behave differently from everybody on the continents. And that's our problem. We don't understand continental powers. We've not been invaded. We never had to worry about armies of hundreds of thousands of Ottoman Turks or Mongolian hordes marching into our countries. Well, the Russians, of course, have a long history of dealing with this sort of thing, and they have a very rich military culture, which means they are not going to engage in fanciful excursions into artificial worlds that don't exist. They're not going to push women into combat. They're not going to push women who are vulnerable, who are important to the nation, whose principal mission is to sustain the nation and bear children and raise families and reinforce the social and political and economic identities of the country. They have no intention of doing such a thing. They are going to maintain robust and capable forces because they know the alternative is disaster, near extermination.
Sure.
Same thing is true in China. Same thing is true in Serbia. We don't have that history, and that's our problem right now. We take too much for granted, and we're in for a hard learning session.
And let's talk about the Serbs for a moment, simply because Serbs were very proactive in this past election. Serbian Americans for Trump were the official coalition partner to the president's campaign. We campaigned around the country with Ambassador Granell. But let's go back to the 1990s for a moment. And you were often criticized, and I must say, I feel personally that this probably, and you may speak to this, that this maybe even stifled your career as somebody who is really brilliant, but you were criticized for some views, for example, saying that NATO, and you agreed with President Trump on this, that NATO is obsolete, that literally in the 1990s, NATO needed to reinvent itself to have a mission, otherwise NATO will not exist. So talk to me about the Clinton doctrine, what happened in the Balkans. The Christian Serbs were allies with the United States through World War I, through World War II. We actually just commemorated the mission Heliard, where the Serbs rescued 500 allied and U.S. military airmen. It was one of the greatest rescue in military warfare. And Clinton's come on, and we know what happened with the Serbs. How does that reflect to today? Because we often talk about colored revolution, we talk about regime change, and we as Serbs who have experienced this feel that this tactic was employed against President Trump.
Well, first of all, just go back for a second to your initial opening statement. Americans, frankly speaking, have no or almost no national memory of the kinds of things that you cited. They have a very, I would say, checkered and fragmented and incomplete view of the two world wars. The only one about which they hear anything is World War II. And to be perfectly blunt with you, we're not very honest about it. People don't really understand what happened and how it happened.
Yes.
It's sort of treated as evidence for the greatness of the American nation that marched in, won everything, and made the world right again. That, of course, is nonsense, but that's what most people believe. So when you take this kind of American mentality and you project it into Europe after the Second World War and NATO, people then concluded, well, this NATO thing is a very good thing. Well, it was a very good thing, and it made a great deal of sense, but it didn't make a great deal of sense once the Soviet state system collapsed.
Sure.
And it did not make sense in the 1990s, frankly speaking, to maintain NATO. And at the time I thought, and many of my peers in the military thought, we should get out. We should bring the forces home, and the Europeans should sit down and determine what it is that they want to be. And they should set up their own structures, their own institutions for national security. Well, it didn't happen because, like everything else in Washington, NATO and all of these external commitments and events involve the redistribution of enormous money.
Mm-hmm.
And people benefit from these redistributions of cash. And so there's enormous support to maintain these commitments. And then there's also another aspect to all of this. A lot of it is, a lot of what goes on overseas is mortgaged to what I would call our national vanity. There's a certain amount of national narcissism at work, and the politicians exploit this to keep things going. In other words, we're always the ones with the white hats. We're always on the right side, and whatever we want to do is the right thing. All of this came together in the 1990s, unfortunately, with a Europe that was, quite frankly, shocked at the sudden collapse of the Soviet state system. And many Europeans, particularly the Germans, thought this is wonderful. We're going to, restore the nation. And I think if we had turned around to the Germans and said, over to you, you've got it, we're out of here, I think many of the Germans would have been very grateful, because the Germans of all the NATO members back in the 1990s and first part of this century were probably the least enthusiastic about intervention in the Balkans.
Sure.
But when the Balkan problem started with the collapse of the Yugoslav state, people saw this in Washington as an opportunity to sort of conduct their multinational, multi-ethnic, whatever you want to call it, experiment overseas. In other words, they saw this as an opportunity to force diversity and equity and all these other things on people with NATO military power. And then they said at the same time, this is wonderful because if we can drag NATO into it, our allies who have not been involved in anything like this, then we'll force cohesion on the alliance. In other words, if NATO is not out of theater, in other words, they used to say if NATO is not out of area, then it's out of business.
Sure.
In other words, if we can't find something for all these forces to do together, then the thing will fall apart. So you wrap those together, and what you get is this utterly insane notion that we should involve ourselves in a part of the world where we as Americans have really never operated, and we should begin to tinker with what we saw as small peoples, a few million here, a few million there, and compel them to do things they would otherwise not do. The Europeans were, for the most part, feckless. The French had mixed feelings. The British, unfortunately, are always looking for an opportunity to be strategically relevant, which means to go along with us. And again, the Germans at the time were very, very skeptical of everything because the Germans have a stronger historical memory. I remember being in Austria at the time, and the Austrians were saying, is this really a good thing what's going on in Bosnia?
Yes.
And they all knew the history of Bosnia-Herzegovina. They knew that they had gone in there and fought a war, most of whom felt it had been a serious mistake. And they also had a history reaching back to the Ottoman Empire. And I remember, the Austrians sitting around talking to me while I was in Vienna for a conference at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And they looked across the table and said, well, we don't necessarily like the Serbs, but, the Serbs were with us in 1683 when we fought the Ottoman Turks. So were the Croats. So were the rest of these people. We really ought to let them sort this out. This is not something we should involve ourselves in. The Germans, I remember the night that we bombed Kosovo, and of course that night with the Kosovo air campaign began with an attack on Belgrade.
Yes.
And the German four-star, who was the chief of staff, was a wonderful man. Tears ran out of his eyes, over his cheeks.
Oh, wow.
And he looked at me and he said, Douglas, this is something we should not be doing. And he was standing in the operations center watching this unfold and turned and walked out. He was a very stoic character. I mean, this is a true Prussian, and he'd been born in Posen, or near Posen, when it was German. This was a very serious-minded man, and he had opposed this whole thing from day one. And the British military, incidentally, and the French military all thought it was crazy. They said, why are we doing this? We don't like it. But there were politicians in the West who saw benefit to it. Now, I can tell you that President Clinton was not involved. President Clinton wasn't interested in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I'm sure some of your listeners will remember how he was confronted publicly by Amanpour on CNN about intervening to rescue the Bosniaks and so forth. His attitude was, we have no business being there. But his vice president, Al Gore, Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, Sandy Berger, the National Security Advisor, and I could go down the whole list.
Yes.
They were all anxious to involve themselves. We've got to go in there, and these people have to be compelled to live together. And I remember at the time saying, well, it seems to me that everybody in Yugoslavia has just fought a pretty serious conflict to get away from each other. And now you want to force them back together again. And when I was involved in the Dayton Accords, where I was asked to go in and draw maps by General Clark for various territorial solutions, one of the things that was not understood, and I kept saying over and over and over again, is there's a lot of blood's being spilled. You've just spilled a great deal of blood. This is not a time to expect people to reconcile. This is not a time to expect people to throw down their arms and march into each other's arms. It's not going to work.